Thank you, thank you. The following is one of my voiceover demos. If you're a voiceover artist and you would like to advertise one of your demos on my podcast, please send an MP3 to thedrill12, all one word, at gmail.com. That's thedrill12 at gmail.com. Back in a minute.
Americans love scenery. We want to see it all, from one coast to the next, Mount Rushmore down to the Everglades. So hop into a Chevy Malibu and take the scenic route. It's the car you knew America could build. There's a place where people count on friendships they can trace back generations, where they can count on the same stool at the coffee shop waiting for them every morning. This place is called Glen Ellen, and you can find it in every bottle of Glen Ellen wine. This is craft brewed Herman Joseph's, the smoothest, easiest drinking specialty beer in the entire solar system. And I believe you'll find drinkable in the dictionary right after don't order a beer you can't drink. Zoingo! Boingo! The freestyle pogo with more boing, more bounce. Bounce further, bounce higher with Zoingo Boingo. To see what makes Arrowhead Mountain Spring water different from those other waters, you have to go back to the source. And with Arrowhead, that means going back a little farther and longer than most. Between security challenged and security strengthened, there's one important word: how. And it is the how that makes all the difference to our nation and our world. Lockheed Martin. We never forget who we're working for. What makes Kraft Singles so good? 2 out of every 3 kids don't get the recommended amount of calcium. But with Kraft Singles, they get a good source of calcium and the taste they love. Kraft Singles. Magic every single time. Throw boring overboard with a new real meal from Long John Silver's. A meal worthy of a plate. Just $4.99. Only at Long John Silver's. We may not all be geniuses, but we can all do something smart. Introducing the Hyundai 199 Sonata Lease. It's a smart deal on a really smart car.
Me and my girlfriend have been here all weekend. We can admit it's too Italian. It's a little much. There's more diversity in North Korea. My girlfriend's half black, ally alert, and she's walking around and everyone's like, "Ooh, you got yourself a Sicilian bro." Oh yeah, we were buying clothes. We went to the boardwalk. We were shopping for clothes at the store. They had a sign for one of the sections. It was just wife beaters. But isn't every shirt in the Jersey Shore a wife beater? Italians are cool, though. Italians are the last white people with, like, their own unique culture still. Besides the Polish. I mean, not even Nazis would rape a Polish woman. My family's 100% German. You can't be proud of that, though. You can be proud of being Italian. You can't be proud of being German. Doesn't that suck? We make one little mistake. We make one little mistake 6 million times, and now... But people forget that the Italians were Nazis, too. But they get away with it because their food's good. You know, you bite into a veal palm, you're like, Benito would never.
Good morning. It's Thursday, Bad News Thursday, September the 12th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have the patriotic shorts, motivation, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, the 33 strategies of war, and bad news. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now, some Varney and Company.
Guys, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Love today. Mark Tepper, Todd Pyro, appreciate your time. That is it for me. I will see all of you tomorrow. Ashley Webster this morning is in for Stuart Varney. Hey, Ashley, good morning.
Hey, good morning, Cheryl. Tell Todd to stop watching those robot movies. They're freaking him out, clearly. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much, guys. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ashley Webster, yes, in today for Stuart Varney. Let's start with the latest read on inflation. Producer prices coming in slightly higher than expected in August, 0.2% month over month, but annual increase came in slightly less than anticipated at 1.7%. So what did the market think about this ho-hum? At least in the pre-market, we can see that the Dow Jones and S&P ever so slightly higher, the NASDAQ ever so slightly lower. So no reaction at all in the pre-market. Let's take a look at the interest rates for you. Let's begin with the 10-year, which has been moving slightly lower, and it still is, down just 0.3 basis points to 3.65. Let's take a look at the 2-year, which also has been moving slightly lower. In fact, it's unchanged, 3.64%. Bitcoin, what is Bitcoin doing today? It has been just below 58,000, and there it is. It's up $311 at 57,644. Gold also sticking around 2,500 at 2,554, up nearly $12 per troy ounce. Oil continuing to move below $70 a barrel, up 84 cents at 68.15. Gas prices edging lower again. Regular averaging $3.24 a gallon. That's down 1 cent. Diesel down 1 cent. We'll take it at $3.63. In politics, the latest Fox News power rankings showing that Kamala Harris now holding an overall lead for the very first time, with 241 electoral college votes. Donald Trump has 219. You need 270 to win, so plenty of electoral college votes in play. Toss-up, as they say. We'll get into it. In Aurora, Colorado, 10 members of a Venezuelan gang have now been arrested in connection with that apartment building takeover. We'll get into that. And an historic moment as SpaceX's Polaris Dawn crew conduct the first ever commercial spacewalk. Very, very cool indeed. We'll be talking about that. It is September 12th, 2024.
And that was Varney and Company. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, cars.
I've got jury duty in Oconee County, and there was no way of me getting out of this. Here I'm in a room, about 50 people. So we're sitting there in the deliberation room, I guess what you call it or whatever. Heck, I'm scrolling through. I'm online looking at cars. Found a really nice 69 SS350 car. Price was right. So I text my dad from court saying, hey, I got a guy bringing by a 69 Camaro. This is how much? It's a nice car. Try to buy it. Then I found a van. Bought it. $1,200. And then the shipper was coming. I had a 68 C10 that I just sold. It was going to Nashville. So I had the shipper getting him lined up to go pick up that truck. There was a bright red OBS truck popped up online. So I got that bought when I was in court. Then my mom decides, you know what? My Escalade, I'm getting tired of it. She said, I want something sporty. My mom's had several Corvettes over the years. Got mom in a new ride. She loves it. And now back to the being in court. So, and of course, they said, well, Rob, how do you feel about it? Guilty. So.
And that was cars. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Patriotic Short.
It happened when a soldier faced 5,000 enemies with 8 rounds. Thomas, the slayer of Shadows Baker, was known for his quiet demeanor. But on one fateful day in 1944, Tommy Feast on the Hearts of My Enemies Baker made his presence known on Saipan. When his company was pinned down by heavy machine gun fire, Baker grabbed a bazooka, dashed within 100 yards, and obliterated the stronghold, allowing his unit to advance. But that was just the beginning. Next, Baker manned a machine gun, taking out 12 Japanese soldiers during an assault. He then swiftly eliminated 6 more who were lying in wait to ambush his friends. But his greatest battle was yet to come. Weeks later, Baker and his men were surrounded by 5,000 Japanese soldiers. From his foxhole, control. He took out scores of enemies until his ammo ran dry. Undeterred, Baker charged into the fray, swinging his rifle like a baseball bat, crushing skulls until the weapon broke apart. Wounded in the chaos, he was dragged to safety, but when his buddy was shot, Baker insisted on staying behind to avoid risking more lives. They propped him against a tree with 8 rounds left in his .45. The next morning, his buddies found him dead, still propped against the same tree, surrounded by 8 dead Japanese soldiers. For his bravery, he was awarded the Medal of Honor.
And that was the Patriotic Short. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, a little bit of motivation.
That is possible, and you are the determining factor. What is the common denominator of failure? Why are you failing? You never say because of me. Oh, it's the competition. It's the economy. It's the president. It's Congress. If you wake up tomorrow morning and blame your failure on someone or something else, you have no reason to change, do you? But if you woke up in the morning and looked in the mirror and said, I am failing because of me, the decisions that I make, the energy I put in, I'm not passing the blame. If you look in the mirror tomorrow and say that, you will change. Because nobody likes thinking of themselves as a failure.
Winners win and losers lose. And if you create a culture of losing, if you keep being a victim, if you keep letting losing happen to you, if you keep letting people do you and treat you any kind of way, it's going to become a culture.
Take ownership. Take ownership of everything in your world, the good and the bad. Don't make excuses. Don't blame any other person or any other thing. Take ownership of your mistakes. Take ownership of your shortfalls. Take ownership of your problems. And then take ownership of the solutions that will get those problems solved. Take ownership of your job, of your team, of your future, and take ownership of your life.
No alarm clock needed. My passion wakes me up. My drive wakes me up. My determination wakes me up. My ability to be, do, and have whatever I want, it wakes me up. What wakes you up? What drives you? Why are you playing this game? You got to begin with the end in mind. So whatever your dream or your goal is, you got to wake up every day to it. You got to go to bed with it. Are you hearing what I'm telling you? You got to read stuff. The music you listen to, everything you do, got to pour into that dream. I didn't get to where I am. I didn't get here being lazy. I didn't get here binge watching TV. I didn't get here taking days off. I personally know what it takes. One day I made a decision that enough is enough. I'm tired of being average. I'm tired. I'm tired of being good. I'm tired. I made a decision. Enough is enough. It's showtime. In order for you to go from one level to the next level, in order for any woman to transition, for any man to transition, the thing that they want must be greater than the thing they currently have. You only transition from one level to the next when you're tired of the level you are. You don't belong at the bottom, and it's time for you to get your butt from down there. It's time for you to stop being comfortable at the bottom. Get your butt up and get to where you're supposed to be. Get where you belong. Do what you're supposed to do. Live like you're supposed to live. You gotta kill. Every single day of my life, I feel like giving 100%. Every single day. I don't have days where I don't feel like it. Why? Because I'm counting on me. My wife's counting on me. My son's counting on me. I don't have days to waste. And your grind has to match your dream. You can't play as much as you used to play. You can't go where you used to go. You can't do what you used to do. And now you got to pick your grind up. And I need you to wake up every single day. And I need you to use your 24 hours like you've never used to before.
Every day is a new day. Every moment is a new moment. So now you got to go out and show them that I'm a different creature. Now. Because I'm pissed off for greatness. Because if you ain't pissed off for greatness, that means you're okay with being mediocre. And no man ain't okay with being just basic.
I dare you to exhaust Ask yourself, I dare you to leave every single thing on the field, one season, everything, walk off exhausted.
Wins and losses come a dime a dozen. But effort, nobody can judge effort. Because effort is between you and you. Effort ain't got nothing to do with nobody else.
I want you to know when you dream your dream that there are other people who are dreaming the exact same dream. When you say to yourself, this is what I want to accomplish, you're not the only person that wants to accomplish it.
And that was a little bit of motivation. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, a little bit of meditation. that was a little bit of meditation. Thank you. And now, the Daily Stoic.
Disintegration. These things don't go together. You must be a unified human being, either good or bad. You must diligently work either on your own reasoning or on things out of your control. Take great care with the inside and not what's outside, which is to say, stand with the philosopher or else with the mob. Epictetus, Discourses, 3.15.13. We're all complicated people. We have multiple sides to ourselves, conflicting wants, desires, and fears. The outside world is no less confusing and contradictory. If we're not careful, all these forces, pushing and pulling, will eventually tear us apart. We can't live as both Jekyll and Hyde. Not for long, anyway. We have a choice to stand with the philosopher and focus strenuously on the inside, or to behave like a leader of a mob, becoming whatever the crowd needs at a given moment. If we do not focus on our internal integration, on self-awareness, we risk external disintegration.
And that was The Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
Many of us are familiar with the phenomenon of addiction, whether it's alcohol or it's to drugs or it's to sex or pornography. All forms of sin are really forms of addiction. When you're caught in addiction, what can't you do? You can't save yourself from it, right? Think of the 12-step programs. The key move in all the 12-step programs is to admit your powerlessness and to turn your life over to a higher power. That's born of Christianity, everybody, that insight. If you say, look, I'm powerless over this addiction, and the more I try through my own efforts to make it right, the worse I'm going to make it. Turn your life over to a higher power. Only in that way are you going to be saved.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Quote, capitalism has been called the system of greed, yet it is the system that raised the standard of living of its poorest citizens to heights no collectivist system has ever begun to equal. Unquote. And that's Ayn Rand from Global Balkanization from the book The Voice of Reason. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the 33 strategies of war.
Reversal. The reversal of passive aggression is aggressive passivity, presenting an apparently hostile face while inwardly staying calm and taking no unfriendly action. The purpose here is intimidation. Perhaps you know you are the weaker of the two sides and hope to discourage your enemies from attacking you by presenting a blustery front. Taken in by your appearance, they will find it hard to believe that you do not intend to do anything. In general, presenting yourself as the opposite of what you really are and intend can be a useful way of disguising your strategies.
And that was the 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. If you're a Democrat, you should vote Republican because aggression against others reverses into aggression against the self. The more a person contains aggression against others, the more strict and coercive the conscience becomes. The internalization of violence also proves useful to the exercise of rule. It ensures that the obedient subject internalizes the external ruling authority, making it a part of itself. This allows the authority to rule with far less effort. Symbolic violence is also a violence that makes use of the mechanism of habit. It inscribes itself within the things that are taken for granted, in habitual patterns of perception and of behavior. Violence is naturalized, as it were. Without the effort of physical, martial violence, it ensures that the established ruling relationship is maintained. The psychological internalization of force also serves disciplinary ends. By way of subtle, discrete interventions, it infiltrates the subject's neural paths and muscle fibers, subjugating it to outside ortho and neurocorrective compulsions and imperatives. The wholesale violence of decapitation, which prevails in the society of sovereignty, yields to the violence of successive subcutaneous deformation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And so, the terrorist who kidnapped Nama Levy on the morning of October 7th was eliminated yesterday. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, a little quote from Megyn Kelly about Taylor Swift, and then I'm going to have a short comment. It's 32 seconds long.
I'm allowed to criticize Taylor Swift, and I don't give a who gets upset. This is disgusting. If she wants to vote Harris Walz, she can do it all she wants. But to say the reason she's doing it is because of Tim Walz's stance on LGBTQ, F you, Taylor Swift, and F all of the people who want to see these children have body parts chopped off and watch them sterilized under the age of consent, and then will ride off to their multi-gazillion-dollar mansions, never to think of them again. I'm allowed.
And so, let's see what we got here.
To criticize Taylor Swift.
Thank you, Megan. No, Megyn Kelly. Right. Okay, so now, kudos, first of all. Absolute kudos for her for not being neutral. It seems like there's more and more people that are getting the message that you're not neutral. Nobody is neutral. Now, a lot of people pretend to be neutral because they're scared. Better to say, you know what, I tell you my opinion, but A, it's none of your business, or B, I'm scared to give you my opinion. I can respect that. But don't pretend you're neutral. You're not fooling anybody. So kudos to Megyn Kelly for not being neutral. She came right out and said exactly what she means. Now, as far as convincing, the problem with the way she approached it is she's not going to convince Taylor Swift or any of her supporters that her support for Harris is wrong. In order to do that, and so Megyn Kelly gets a C. Again, if I had to give her a grade, I'd give her a C, a solid C. She wants a B or an A, then what she needs to do is appeal to Taylor Swift's political interests. Why does she want, okay, she says LGBTQ, and then you as Megyn Kelly need to say, Taylor Swift, the woman's not going to do it. Okay? You want to go out and approach it that way. Hey, I respect that you got a different opinion than I do. I think it's a terrible idea to transform kids. I think it's a terrible idea, but she's not going to do it. Because if she was going to do that, if she and Waltz were going to LGBTQ, they'd have done it already. If she and Biden were going to do it, they'd have done it already. That they have a history of making promises and not just breaking them, but ignoring them, etc. That's the way then you can appeal to you've got to appeal to the other side. Otherwise, all Megyn Kelly is doing is preaching to the choir. She's talking to the choir of the First Church of Megyn Kelly. All of her supporters, I'm sure, are cheering about this. And I like to hear it myself. But again, more power, that's good power, but even more power is to reach across the aisle and be able to persuade the other side to at least think about who they're voting for and appeal to them from, their own self-interest, so to speak. We've got George Gascon, who's our Los Angeles County District Attorney, who's up for re-election. And again, today I heard John Cobelt saying that anybody who votes for him is completely insane and blah, 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 blah. All he's doing is preaching to the First Church of John Cobelt. He's preaching to his listeners. His listeners are not going to vote for George Gascon. None of them. That's why they listen to John Cobelt, okay? If John Cobelt wants to be even more effective, and again, John Cobelt gets the same grade, a C, for not being neutral about it or pretending to be neutral, but he could be even better. He could get a B or an A by reaching out to the people that voted for Gascon last time and voted for Gascon for one basic reason. They expected him, and he promised to prosecute police officers, and he didn't prosecute one. He didn't even get an indictment against any police officers. So that's the way you're going to reach the people that might be interested in voting for him, because the people that listen to John Cobelt aren't going to vote for George Gascon anyways. I mean, they're just not going to do it. So you got to reach the people that are tempted to vote for him. And those are his supporters, and his supporters expected him to prosecute cops. He failed to do it, and you need to say that. Hey, those of you that voted for him and are thinking about voting for him again, why bother? Why bother? And then you're getting a B or an A, because now you're going to have much more influence than you had before. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the next chapter on bad news, how woke media is undermining democracy. Chapter 7, A Great Awakening. Now the chapter is 54 minutes long, so I'm going to cut it in half and do 27 minutes this week and 27 minutes next.
Chapter 7, A Great Awakening. It's difficult to pinpoint when exactly our current moment began. But you can find evidence that something has changed in the recent headlines in the New York Times, as well as almost every other major national news outlet. Is the white church inherently racist? How racist is Trump's Republican Party? Trump's racist, statist, suburban dream? How racist urban planning left some neighborhoods to swelter, confronting racist marketing, how to raise an anti-racist kid, petition urges Trader Joe's to get rid of racist branding, can I stay friends with someone who voices racist views? 2 Georgia high schoolers posted racist video, officials say, and FIT model refuses to wear clearly racist accessories. When did this newfound obsession with re-racializing all of American life begin? I started writing about what people now call wokeness at least as early as 2014, the Atlantic writer Connor Friedersdorf recalled. It seemed to me that there was some new moral thing in the air that I did not recognize from when I was in college. I didn't yet see it in journalism, at least not like it's there today. Back in 2014, journalists were able to cover wokeness because it hadn't yet become their own ideology. There was skepticism early on before it became the more prevailing position among journalists, Friedersdorf said. Not anymore. I don't think that a majority of journalists actually adhere to these beliefs, but I do think that they are the beliefs that people are afraid to openly transgress against. Thomas Chatterton Williams, a memoirist who writes about race and who is a vocal critic of cancel culture, first noticed it during President Obama's second term in office. By the second term, social media had become much more widely in use, which coincided with the disillusionment that followed the optimism of Obama's win, he told me. That's when the idea that white supremacy is hardwired into the DNA of America began to be popularized by writers like Ta-Nehisi Coates. And it was directly related to a new consensus around race. I'm convinced part of why now is because things are better than they've ever been. You don't get this level of complaint until much more fundamental concerns and obstacles have been taken care of. For journalist Matt Taibbi, the first time he noticed the trend toward wokeness was during the 2016 primary, when Hillary Clinton sought to recast Bernie Sanders' attacks on her Wall Street ties as oblivious to more pressing issues. If we broke up the big banks tomorrow, would that end racism? Would that end sexism? Would that end discrimination against the LGBT community? Would that make people feel more welcoming to immigrants overnight? Clinton asked a crowd in Nevada, who roared back, "No," in response to each question. It was enormously successful because it just completely changed the conversation, Taibbi told me. It made Democratic voters think of those two aims as mutually exclusive, social justice aims and class equality aims. If you're concerned about the one, then you can't be concerned about the other. It started this whole debate which continues to animate everybody in left media to a degree that's incredibly annoying now, that it's class or race, whereas really it's class and race. That there has been an erasure of class from the conversation in favor of a conversation focused exclusively on race and, to a lesser degree, gender, is not just based on anecdotal evidence. Data and political scientists have been tallying the numbers, and what they found is not only a huge spike in articles on woke topics, but that this focus started much earlier than you might think. As Williams, Friedersdorf, and Taibbi all noted, it was not a reaction to Trump's shocking 2016 victory, but was already well underway by then. Based on quantitative data, already by the second half of Obama's presidency, journalists at leading publications had begun using words from the woke vocabulary like white privilege, systemic racism, and intersectionality with staggering frequency, mainstreaming a worldview that had been relegated to the fringes of academia just a few years earlier. The increased use of these terms started in 2011. Not surprisingly, the same year the New York Times erected an online paywall and started investing in making its digital publication profitable. This is what was found by David Rosado, a computer scientist who teaches at New Zealand's Otago Polytechnic. Rosado created a computer program that trawled the online archives of the Times from 1970 to 2018 to track the frequency with which certain words were used. What he found was that the frequency of words like racism, white supremacy, KKK, traumatizing, marginalized, hate speech, intersectionality, and activism had absolutely skyrocketed during that time. His work does not stand alone. It echoes that of another academic, Zach Goldberg, a PhD candidate in political science at Georgia State University. Goldberg found that from 2012 to 2016, as the digital readership of the New York Times tripled, media outlets like the Times, the Huffington Post, and BuzzFeed began covering topics like white privilege, social justice, and institutional racism with exponential regularity, which correlated strongly with a massive spike in Google search results for these topics. And as those searches rose in number, so did the number of New York Times, Huffington Post, Washington Post, and BuzzFeed articles about racism, privilege, people of color, white tears, white-splaining, structural racism, and slavery. Goldberg further found that between 2013 and 2019, the frequency of the words white and racial privilege grew by an astonishing 1,200% in the Times and by 1,500% in the Washington Post. The term white supremacy was used fewer than 75 times in 2010 in the Washington Post and the New York Times, but over 700 times in 2020 alone. At NPR, it was used 2,400 times. The word racism appeared in the Washington Post over 4,000 times in 2020. That's the equivalent of using it in 10 articles a day. Furthermore, the Times and other liberal publications developed a penchant for associating the word racism with the term white people, so much so that these words became the strongest predictor for the inclusion of racism or racist, Goldberg found. How did all this happen? Insiders will tell you it started in the newsroom. Take the New York Times. Between 2008 and 2015, there were a series of big buyouts at the paper, sometimes leading to hundreds of reporters at a time leaving or retiring. These reductions disproportionately cleared out senior ranks of reporters who had a more traditional view of journalism, in which a big part of the mandate, the meaning, and the fun of being a journalist was exposing yourself and your readers to other cultures and other people, and helping others to understand them. In the buyouts, these reporters were replaced by a younger generation of digital natives, some journalists, some in ancillary digital roles, who were educated at elite institutions and viewed their roles less as understanding their subjects and more as sitting in judgment over those they disagreed with. And that's had an enormous effect on the paper. While at one time, the older journalists taught the younger ones how to think, after the buyouts, this younger generation, armed with their judgments and accusations of racism and sexism, became the ones wielding immense influence over their older colleagues. Insiders at the Times describe an atmosphere in which an older generation of editors and staff has completely capitulated to a younger, woke generation. As one longtime Times journalist explained it to me, imagine having the stress of being replaced by someone younger with better tech skills, and then imagine that that person calls you a racist to boot, and you'll know the fear that older journalists experience and why they have ceded so much moral authority to younger ones. And it's not just moral authority. Sometimes journalists of this younger generation have accrued big social media followings, which they wield as a cudgel, both against Times management and against colleagues whose work displeases them. But it wasn't just the buyouts that led the Times there. The Times' 2014 Innovation Report explicitly suggested that journalists should create their own social media brands in order to amass loyal followings. The paper's leadership saw its future in digital media, in a younger generation who could make that change happen, and thus needed to be courted and shown respect. The report demanded that the Times accept that digital talent is in high demand, suggesting that to hire digital talent will take more money, more persuasion, and more freedom once they are within the Times, even when candidates might strike us as young or less accomplished. Leadership must identify the rising digital stars in the newsroom, show them that they are appreciated, and solicit ideas from them on how the Times can be better. The point, it seems, was taken. You can see this generational dynamic playing out in the leaked transcript of a town hall that the executive editor of the Times, Dean Baquet, was forced to call after an uproar over a headline that failed to call President Trump a racist. I'm wondering to what extent you think that the fact of racism and white supremacy being sort of the foundation of this country should play into our reporting, a staff member asked Baquet in 2019. Just because it feels to me like it should be a starting point, you know? Like these conversations about what is racist, what isn't racist. I just feel like racism isn't everything. It should be considered in our science reporting, in our culture reporting, in our national reporting. Baquet agreed. Race in the next year, and I think this is, to be frank, what I would hope you come away from this discussion with, race in the next year is going to be a huge part of the American story, he replied. And I mean race in terms of not only African Americans and their relationship with Donald Trump, but Latinos and immigration. And I think that one of the things I would love to come out of this with is for people to feel very comfortable coming to me and saying, here's how I would like you to consider telling that story. Baquet made good on his promise. The coverage of immigration from a racial point of view and the coverage of Donald Trump and his supporters as uniformly racist have been mainstays of the Times over the past 4 years, as we have seen in previous chapters. But it's not just the New York Times, though the paper's influence on the industry cannot be overstated. Wokeness has taken over national newsrooms, and it's influencing everything from coverage to personnel decisions to workplace culture. In 2019, WNYC took the entire station on a 2-day off-campus diversity retreat to examine whiteness. Everyone had to fill out a questionnaire that included questions like, is the food that you grew up with readily available in your supermarket? If you go to a high-end clothing store, do you find that the clerk pays too much attention to you and follows you around? And how many times have you been pulled over by the police? Their answers were then tallied to create a literal score of oppression, and they were placed in a semicircle based on their scores so everyone knew where everyone else fell in the hierarchy. A senior editor at one of the better-known general interest online news publications described the newsroom to me as full of ordinary office radicals who believe in some pretty wild things. We should have no police, the rich should be abolished, that this is all awesome, especially among the younger workers, and the reporters who skew younger thanks to a decision management made because younger workers are cheaper and they don't use their health insurance as a rule and don't cost as much that way. And these young journalists end up writing in a very specific way, as the editor explained. If you're 25 years old looking at the state of society, you're getting constantly inundated with this coverage of how bad things are. And many things are actually bad. And then you're considering how previous generations dealt with this and how respectability politics, white ones, black ones, have not produced a more equitable society. And you're like, yeah, let me go all the way. That seems morally right. I totally get that as a starting point of assumptions and how you end up there, especially if you're thinking about race. But you're not immersed in it. It's not your daily lived experience. I completely get how normal, decent people end up there. And now they're pushing the discourse in a way that's just weird and disconnected from how politics actually works. Disconnected though it is, that single narrative has taken hold at America's leading journalistic outlets, and it's being reinforced at the personal, political, and business levels of journalism, as well as in questions of workplace culture and personnel. Of course, we're not the first generation of journalists to be seduced by a grand narrative, Friedersdorf pointed out. After 9/11, the prevailing mythology was that we were in a clash of civilizations with Islam and terrorism was the biggest threat to society. There was a time when the communist threat was the prevailing narrative. During war, American journalism gets jingoistic. The narrative right now is that white supremacy and patriarchy are the biggest problems in society, and attacking those problems as remorselessly as possible is the way toward a better society, Friedersdorf told me. I think it does a poor job of analyzing the range and magnitude of the problems that face us as a society, and I think it does more to tear us apart than it does to bring us together. Now, it would be one thing if America were getting more and more racist, if white people were, as the magnitude of Times articles would suggest, good predictors for the existence of racism. Then one could argue that the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, and the Los Angeles Times were doing their job in covering American life. But that would not explain why the newfound woke journalism is also obsessed with chattel slavery, a fact of American history that has not, thankfully, renewed itself in the past 150 years. And still, as Goldberg found, articles about slavery have risen exponentially in the past decade. More importantly, it's simply not true that racism, like the coverage of it in the Times and other liberal media outlets would suggest, is on the rise. Of course, racism persists in a number of areas that are urgently in need of amelioration. A study published in Nature Human Behavior found that Black Americans were disproportionately stopped and pulled over by the police. A disparity that shrank after nightfall when a veil of darkness masks one's race, as the researchers put it. Equally horrifying is the finding of a Harvard economist who concluded that based on data from New York City's stop and frisk program, when it comes to non-lethal uses of force, police putting their hands on people, slapping or grabbing them, or pushing them into a wall or onto the ground, there are large and shocking racial differences in which groups get violated. Black and Hispanic Americans are over 50% more likely to be subjected to some form of force in interactions with police. And a Cato Institute study found that Black Americans are twice as likely as white Americans to report a police officer swearing at them or to know someone who has been physically abused by the police. It's not just in policing or mass incarceration that these gaps exist. A history of racist policies like redlining is responsible for much of the remaining wealth gap between white and Black families. Our public schools remain effectively segregated by race, and a larger percentage of Black and Latino Americans are stuck in intergenerational poverty than white Americans. And people of color continue to be overrepresented as the victims of violent crime. Every one of these issues deserves our attention, and as a society, we must be committed to eradicating them once and for all. The problem is that's not what the woke narrative is doing. Rather than seeking out solutions to the actual problems that continue to plague our society, problems one can point to, and solutions one can try. The woke narrative casts America as irredeemably racist and ineluctably tainted by white supremacy. And in so doing, it erases not only the facts, but the true solutions to our remaining problems. For example, the Cato Institute study that found a disparity in how often Black and white people were verbally and physically abused by the police also found a class difference in how often the police pulled over members of the two groups. Higher income African Americans report being stopped at about 1.5 times the rate of higher income white Americans. In contrast, lower income African Americans report being stopped only slightly more frequently than lower income white Americans. Meanwhile, despite what you will read every day in the national liberal news media, the Harvard economist found that when it comes to officer-involved shootings, there are no racial differences between white and Black Americans. How can we stop police officers shooting unarmed civilians if we're focused on the wrong cause? In fact, when it comes to racism more generally, the last half-century in America have seen a radical sea change. It's true that the white supremacists who still exist have gotten more prominent and organized in recent years, but they are hardly a reflection of American society writ large, which holds them in the utmost contempt, marginalizing and reviling the remaining members of the KKK and other white supremacist and white nationalist groups. While support for interracial marriage may not be proof positive of a lack of racial animus, certainly people who oppose interracial marriage can be safely considered racist, and they too have been steadily disappearing. The view that liberals have the monopoly on caring about racism is equally spurious. In recent years, Republicans have been at the forefront of criminal justice reform. Red states like Oklahoma, Georgia, and Idaho have been quietly releasing prisoners and reforming their criminal justice systems for the better part of a decade. Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch has consistently sided with the liberal justices in criminal justice cases. Trump's First Step Act released thousands of Black men from prison. Even when it comes to police brutality, Republicans have been newly vocal. In the wake of George Floyd's killing in 2020, the South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham announced that he was seeking proposals to improve policing and combat racial discrimination regarding the use of force. Soon after, Senator Tim Scott, the only Black Republican senator, introduced a police reform bill. It was later killed by Democrats. Scott and Graham were joined by none other than then Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who told reporters in the wake of Floyd's murder, "We are still wrestling with America's original sin. It is perfectly clear we are a long way from the finish line." And at a luncheon for Republican senators, Tom Cotton of Arkansas stood up and said, "Young Black men have a very different experience with law enforcement in this nation than white people, and that's their impression and experience, and we need to be sensitive to that and do all we can to change it." They aren't only speaking for themselves. Despite what the media tells us, there just isn't a partisan divide over this issue. More than 2/3 of Americans say that George Floyd's murder represents a broader problem within law enforcement, and 74% supported the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020. That includes 76% of independents and 53% of Republicans. It's a seismic shift that sociologists attribute mainly to change among white conservatives. This is not to say that America is short of actual racists. People like Derek Chauvin, the police officer who kept his knee on George Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes, draining the life out of him. But what America has become thankfully denuded of is people willing to defend Chauvin. Complicating the partisan narrative further is the fact that it is liberal cities like New York where the public schools are the most segregated and where the educational outcomes for minority students are the worst. And it is cities that Democrats have ruled for decades, Detroit, Cleveland, Baltimore, even Atlanta, where the worst outcomes for Black children and Black lives persist in the form of crime and intergenerational poverty. Perhaps most damning of all, it was white liberals, those people most woke and most keen on prioritizing race in every discussion, whom researchers found have a tendency to dumb down their language when speaking to Black people, a form of ugly racial stereotyping that the researchers discovered white conservatives do not engage in. Similar evidence exists debunking the concept of intersectionality, another far-left academic staple that's been mainstreamed in recent years. The concept was developed by Columbia Law School professor Kimberly Crenshaw as a critique of identity politics. In a seminal 1989 essay, Crenshaw argued that by dividing people into groups by gender, race, class, and sexuality, identity politics had failed to account for people who occupy more than one of those categories, Black women, for example, or queer Native Americans. Crenshaw suggested that if your identity belongs to more than one oppressed category, your experience of oppression would be compounded by that confluence. Crenshaw's work joined a growing rebuke not just of identity politics, but of the civil rights movement and the desire for a colorblind society, in which she saw the stubborn endurance of the structures of white dominance. Somehow, despite this stubbornness, Crenshaw's views went mainstream. In 2015, intersectionality entered the Oxford English Dictionary, and the 2017 Women's March on Washington truly popularized the term. Its leaders made a point of describing themselves and their brand of feminism as intersectional, which in turn launched a host of explainers in left-leaning media outlets like the New York Times, NPR, the Huffington Post, and Vox. The word has migrated from women's studies journals and conference keynotes into everyday conversation, turning what was once highbrow discourse into hashtag chatter, wrote the Chronicle of Higher Education later that year. By 2018, Ashley Judd was extolling the limitless possibilities of equality, diversity, inclusion, intersectionality at the Oscars. Our future is female, intersectional, powered by our belief in one another, tweeted Kirsten Gillibrand, a New York senator who would run for president. As is so often the case with wokeness, the theory's ballooning popularity coincided with the growing mountain of evidence that it was wrong, at least factually. A study from 2020 published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics found that while Black men earn substantially less than white men from a similar economic background, Black women earn slightly more than comparably endowed white women. Black women are also more likely to go to college than white men from similar backgrounds, and the findings from a study at Michigan State University looking at the earnings of African women immigrants were even more stark, though the researchers set out with an explicitly intersectional point of view. The double disadvantage would predict that Black African women would be disadvantaged by the interaction of their race and gender, they wrote. They concluded the opposite. Our findings indicate that Black African migrant women experience no racial disadvantage in their earnings. The income growth rate of African immigrants in the United States had outpaced that of both men and women born in the U.S. Meanwhile, as Rav Arora pointed out in an article in Quillette, white men often fare worse than women of color in direct contravention of intersectionality's predictions. According to the most recent census data, Iranian, Turkish, and Asian American women all out-earned white men. Even the Trump phenomenon, according to the media, the most flamboyant display of white supremacy this nation has seen for a while, ushered in more disgust with racism and more appetite for equality. As political scientists Daniel J. Hopkins and Samantha Washington noted in a 2020 journal article in Public Opinion Quarterly, via most measures, white Americans' expressed anti-Black and anti-Hispanic prejudice declined after Trump's political emergence. There is nothing short of a full-on consensus for the first time in American history about the importance of racial equality. And it is in the context of this consensus that the media has been engaged in what can only be called a moral panic about racism. In other words, as America has gotten less racist, the media has gotten more obsessed with racism. As actual racist ideas became taboo and conservatives began to embrace ideas like diversity and express horror at police shooting unarmed Black men, there was an explosion of the number of Americans who, when asked what the biggest problem facing the United States is, answered racism. Instead of joining hands with their new partners on the right, instead of zeroing in on things like the intergenerational poverty of inner cities and mass incarceration, the national media started.
And that was the first half of Chapter 7, A Great Awakening. From Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy by Batya Unger Sargon. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there and reminding you that you are not neutral and that the government has no rights.